Menzengerstein by Edgar Allan Poe. Pessis eram vivas, moriens tua mors ero. Martin Luther. Horror and fatality have been stalking abroad in all ages. Why then give a date to the story I have to tell? Let it suffice to say that at the period of which I speak, there existed in the interior of Hungary a settled, although hidden belief in the doctrines of the metempsychosis, of the doctrines themselves, that is, of their falsity, or of their probability. I say nothing. I assert, however, that much of our incredulity, as La Boyère says of all our unhappiness, viet dini boaviro etri sueris. But there were some points in the Hungarian superstition which were fast verging to absurdity. They, the Hungarians, differed very essentially from their Eastern authorities. For example, the soul, said the former, I give the words of the acute and intelligent Parisian, ne lumière que ou zero veos dans un corps sensible al reste al cheval un chalin un homme meme inest que la resemblance pour tangible de ces animaux. The families of Berlifitzing and Menzengerstein have been at variance for centuries. Never before were two houses so illustrious, mutually embittered by hostility so deadly. The origin of this enmity seems to be found in the words of an ancient prophecy. A lofty name shall have a fearful fall when, as the rider over his horse, the mortality of Menzengerstein shall triumph over the immortality of Berlifitzing. To be sure, the words themselves had little or no meaning, but more trivial causes have given rise, and that no long while ago, to consequences equally eventful. Besides, the estates, which were contagious, had long exercised a rival influence in the affairs of a busy government. Moreover, near neighbors are seldom friends, and the inhabitants of Castle Berlifitzing might look from their lofty buttresses into the very windows of the Palace Menzengerstein. Least of all had the more than feudal magnificence thus discovered a tendency to allay the irritable feelings of the less ancient and less wealthy Berlifitzings. What wonder, then, that the words, however silly, of that prediction should have succeeded in setting and keeping at variance two families already predisposed to quarrel by every instigation of hereditary jealousy. The prophecy seemed to imply, if it implied anything, a final triumph on the part of the already more powerful house, and was of course remembered with the more bitter animosity by the weaker and less influential. Wilhelm, Count Berlifitzing, although loftily descended, was, at the epoch of this narrative, an infirm and doting old man, remarkable for nothing but an inordinate and intervenient personal antipathy to the family of his rival, and so passionate a love of horses and of hunting that neither bodily infirmity, great age, nor mental incapacity prevented his daily participation in the dangers of the chase. Frederick, Baron Menzengerstein was, on the other hand, not yet of age. His father, the Mr. G., died young. His mother, the Lady Mary, followed him quickly. Frederick was, at that time, in his 18th year. In a city, 18 years are no long period, but in a wilderness, in so magnificent a wilderness as that old principality, the pendulum vibrates with a deeper meaning. From some peculiar circumstances attending the administration of his father, the young baron, at the descent of the former, entered immediately upon his vast possessions. Such estates were seldom held before by a nobleman of Hungary. His castles were without number. The chief in point of splendor and extent was the Palace Menzengerstein. The boundary line of his dominions was never clearly defined, but his principal park embraced a circuit of 50 miles. Upon the succession of a proprietor so young, with a character so well known, to a fortunate so unparalleled, little speculation was afloat in regard to his probable course of conduct, and indeed, for the space of 3 days, the behavior of the heir out-Heroded Herod, the fairly surpassed the expectations of his most enthusiastic admirers. Shameful debaucheries, flagrant treacheries, unheard of atrocities, gave his trembling vassals quickly to understand that no servile submission on their part, nor punctilios of conscience on their own, were thenceforward to prove any security against the remorseless fangs of a petty Caligula. On the night of the 4th day, the stables of Castle Berlifitzing were discovered to be on fire, and the unanimous opinion of the neighborhood added the crime of the incendiary to the already hideous list of the baron's misdemeanors and enormities. But during the tumult occasioned by this occurrence, the young nobleman himself sat apparently buried in meditation, in a vast and desolate upper apartment of the family palace of Menzengerstein. The rich, although faded tapestry hangings which swung gloomily upon the walls represented the shadowy and majestic forms of 1,000 illustrious ancestors. Here, rich ermined priests and pontifical dignitaries, familiarly seated with the autocrat and a sovereign, put a veto on the wishes of a temporal king, or restrained with a fiat of papal supremacy the rebellious scepter of the arch-enemy. There, the dark, tall statue of the Princes Menzengerstein, their muscular war courtiers plunging over the carcasses of fallen foes, startled the steadiest nerves with their vigorous expression. And here, again, the voluptuous and swan-like figures of the dames of days gone by floated away in the mazes of an unreal dance to the strains of imaginary melody. But as the baron listened, or affected to listen, to the gradually increasing uproar in the stables of Berlifitzing, or perhaps pondered upon some more novel, some more decided act of audacity, his eyes were turned unwittingly to the figure of an enormous and unnaturally colored horse, represented in the tapestry as belonging to the Saracen ancestor of the family of his rival. The horse itself, in the foreground of the design, stood motionless and statue-like, while farther back its discomfited rider perished by the dagger of a Menzengerstein. On Frederick's lip arose a fiendish expression, as he became aware of the direction which his glance had, without his consciousness, assumed. Yet he did not remove it. On the contrary, he could by no means account for the overwhelming anxiety which appeared falling like a pall upon his senses. It was with difficulty that he recollected his dreamy and incoherent feelings with the certainty of being awake. The longer he gazed, the more absorbing became the spell, the more impossible did it appear that he could ever withdraw his glance from the fascination of that tapestry. But the tumult, without becoming suddenly more violent, with a compulsory exertion, he diverted his attention to the glare of ruddy light thrown full by the flaming stables upon the windows of the apartment. The action, however, was but momentary. His gaze returned mechanically to the wall. To his extreme horror and astonishment, the head of the gigantic steed had, in the meantime, altered its position. And the neck of the animal, before arched, as if in compassion over the prostrate body of its lord, was now extended at full length in the direction of the Baron. The eyes, before invisible, now wore an energetic and human expression, while they gleamed with a fiery and unusual red, and the distended lips of the apparently enraged horse left in full view his sepulchral and disgusting teeth. Stupefied with terror, the young nobleman tottered to the door. As he threw it open, a flash of red light, streaming far into the chamber, flung his shadow with a clear outline against the quivering tapestry, and he shuddered to perceive that shadow. As he staggered a while upon the threshold, assuming the exact position, and precisely falling upon the contour of the relentless and triumphant murderer of the Saracen Berlifitzing. To lighten the depression of his spirits, the Baron hurried into the open air. At the principal gate of the palace he encountered 3 equerries. With much difficulty, and at the imminent peril of their lives, they were restraining the convulsive plunges of a gigantic and fiery-colored horse. "Whose horse? Where did you get him?" demanded the youth, in a querulous and husky tone, as he became instantly aware that the mysterious steed in that tapestried chamber was the very counterpart of the furious animal before his eyes. "He's your own property, sire," replied one of the equerries. "At least, he is claimed by no other owner. We caught him flying, or smoking and foaming with rage, from the burning stables of Castle Berlifitzing. Supposing him to have belonged to the old count's stud of foreign horses, we led him back to the estuary, but the grooms there disclaim any title to the creature, which is strange, since she bears evident marks of having made a narrow escape from the flames." The letters WVB are also branded very distinctly on his forehead, interrupted the second equerry. "I suppose them, of course, to be initials of Wilhelm von Berlifitzing. But all the castle are positive in denying any knowledge of the horse." "Extremely singular," said the young Baron, with a musing air, and apparently unconscious of the meaning of his words. "He is, as you say, a remarkable horse, a prodigious horse, although, as you very justly observe, of a suspicious and untractable character. Let him be mine, however," he added after a pause. "Perhaps a rider like Frederick of Menzengerstein may tame even the devil from the stables of Berlifitzing." "You are mistaken, my lord. The horse, as I think we mentioned, is not from the stables of the Count. If such had been the case, we know our duty better than to bring him into the presence of a noble of your family." "True," observed the Baron dryly, and at that instant the page of the bedchamber came from the palace with a heightened colour and a precipitate step. he whispered into his master's ear an account of the sudden disappearance of a small portion of the tapestry in an apartment which he designated, entering at the same time into no particulars of a minute and circumstantial character. But from the low tone of voice in which these latter were communicated, nothing escaped to gratify the excited curiosity of the equerries. The young Frederick, during the conference, seemed agitated by the variety of emotions. He soon, however, recovered his composure, and an expression of determined malignancy settled upon his countenance, as he gave peremptory orders that the apartment in question should be immediately locked up, and the key placed in his own possession. "Have you heard of the unhappy death of the old hunter, Berlifingsig?" said one of his vassals to the Baron, as, after the departure of the page, the huge steed which that nobleman had adopted as his own plunged and curveted with redoubled fury down the long avenue which extended from the palace to the stables of Menzengerstein. "No," said the Baron, turning abruptly towards the speaker. "Dead, you say? Is indeed true, my lord, and to the noble of your name will be, I imagine, no unwelcome intelligence." A rapid smile shot over the countenance of the listener. "How died he?" "In his rash exertions to rescue a favourite portion of his hunting stud, he has himself perished miserably in the flames." "Indeed," ejaculated the Baron, as if slowly and deliberately impressed with the truth of some exciting idea. "Shocking!" said the youth calmly, and turned quietly into the palace. From this date a marked alteration took place in the outward demeanour of the desolate young Baron Frederick von Menzengerstein. Indeed, his behaviour disappointed every expectation, and proved little in accordance with the views of many a manoeuvring mamma, while his habits and manners, still less than formerly, offered anything congenial with those of the neighbouring aristocracy. He was never to be seen beyond the limits of his own domain, and, in this wide and social world, was utterly companionless, unless indeed that unnatural, imperious, and fiery-coloured horse, which he henceforth continually bestrode, had any mysterious right to the title of his friend. Numerous invitations on the part of the neighbourhood for a long time, however, periodically came in. "Will the Baron honour our festivals with his presence? Will the Baron join us in the hunting of the boar? Menzengerstein does not hunt. Menzengerstein will not attend," were the haughty and laconic answers. These repeated insults were not to be endured by an imperious nobility. Such invitations became less cordial, less frequent. In time they ceased altogether. The widow of the unfortunate Count Berlifingsig was even heard to express a hope that the Baron might be at home when he did not wish to be at home, since he detained the company of his equals, and ride when he did not wish to ride, since he preferred the society of a horse. This, to be sure, was a very silly explosion of hereditary pique, and merely proved how singularly unmeaning our sayings are apt to become when we desire to be unusually energetic. The charitable nevertheless attributed the alteration in the conduct of the young nobleman to the natural sorrow of a son for the untimely loss of his parents, forgetting, however, his atrocities and reckless behaviour during the short period immediately succeeding that bereavement. Some there were, indeed, who suggested a too haughty idea of self-consequence and dignity. Others again, among whom may be mentioned the family physician, did not hesitate in speaking of morbid melancholy and hereditary ill health, while dark hints of a more equivocal nature were current among the multitude. Indeed, the Baron's perverse attachment to his lately acquired charter, an attachment which seemed to attain new strength from every fresh example of an animal's ferocious and demon-like propensities, at length became, in the eyes of all reasonable men, a hideous and unnatural fervor. In the glare of the noon, at the dead hour of night, in sickness or in health, in calm or in tempest, the young Menzengerstein seemed riveted to the saddle of that colossal horse, whose intractable audacities so well accorded with his own spirit. There were circumstances, moreover, which, coupled with late events, gave an unearthly and portentous character to the mania of the rider, and to the capabilities of the steed. The space passed over in a single leap had been accurately measured, and was found to exceed by an astounding difference the wildest expectations and most imaginative. The Baron, besides, had no particular name for the animal, although all the rest in his collection were distinguished by characteristic appellations. His stable, too, was appointed at a distance from the rest, and with regard to grooming and other necessary offices, none but the owner in person had ventured to officiate, or even to enter the enclosure of that horse's particular stall. It was also to be observed that although the 3 grooms who had caught the steed as he fled from the conflagration of Berlichingen had succeeded in arresting his course by means of a chain, bridle, and noose, yet no one of the 3 could with any certainty affirm that he had, during that dangerous struggle, or at any period thereafter, actually placed his hand upon the body of the beast. Instances of peculiar intelligence in the demeanor of a noble and high-spirited horse are not to be supposed capable of exciting unreasonable attention, but there were certain circumstances which intruded themselves perforce upon the most skeptical and phlegmatic, and it is said there were times when the animal caused the gaping crowd who stood around to recoil in horror from the deep and impressive meaning of his terrible stamp. Times when the young Menzengerstein turned pale and shrunk away from the rapid and searching expression of his earnest and human-looking eye. Among all the retinue of the Baron, however, none were found to doubt the ardor of that extraordinary affection which existed on the part of the young nobleman for the fiery qualities of his horse. At least, none but an insignificant and misshapen little page, whose deformities were in everybody's way, and whose opinions were of the least possible importance. He, if his ideas are worth mentioning at all, had the effrontery to assert that his master never vaulted into the saddle without an unaccountable and almost imperceptible shudder, and that upon his return from every long-continued and habitual ride, an expression of triumphant malignity disordered every muscle in his countenance. One tempestuous night, Menzengerstein, awaking from heavy slumber, descended like a maniac from his chamber, and, mounting in hot haste, bounded away into the mazes of the forest, an occurrence so common, attracting no particular attention, and his return was looked for with intense anxiety on the part of his domestics, when, after some hours' absence, the stupendous and magnificent battlements of the Palace Menzengerstein were discovered crackling and rocking to their very foundation, under the influence of a dense and livid mass of ungovernable fire. As the flames, when first seen, had already made so terrible a progress that all efforts to save any portion of the building were evidently futile, the astonished neighborhood stood idly around in silent, if not apathetic, wonder. But a new and fearful object soon riveted the attention of the multitude, and proved how much more intense is the excitement wrought in the feelings of a crowd by the contemplation of human agony than that brought about by the most appalling spectacles of inanimate matter. Up the long avenue of aged oaks which led from the forest to the main entrance of the palace Menzengerstein, a steed bearing an unbonneted and disordered rider was seen leaping with an impetuosity which outstripped the very demon of the tempest. The career of the horseman was indisputably, on his own part, uncontrollable. The agony of his countenance, the convulsive struggle of his frame gave evidence of superhuman exertion, but no sound, save a solitary shriek, escaped from his lacerated lips, which were bitten through and through in the intensity of terror. One instant of the clattering of hoofs resounded sharply and shrilly above the roaring of the flames and the shrieking of the wind. Another, and clearing at a single plunge the gateway and the moat, the steed bounded far up the tottering staircases of the palace, and, with its rider, disappeared amid the whirlwind of chaotic fire. The fury of the tempest immediately died away, and the dead calm sullenly succeeded. A white flame still enveloped the building like a shroud, and, streaming far away into the quiet atmosphere, shot forth a glare of preternatural light, while a cloud of smoke settled heavily over the battlements in the distant colossal figure of a horse. Notes. Mercier in La 2430 seriously maintains the doctrines of the metempsychosis, and Dr. Israeli, says that no system is so simple and so little repugnant to the understanding. Colonel Ethan Allen, the Green Mountain Boy, is also to have been a serious metempsychosist.